tutorials, we've had, 20 to 15 to 20, 30 to 60-minute long presentations, and we're collapsing all of those or some of those into these 5-minute lightning talks today. So what you'll get is kind of necessarily short, but hopefully give you enough information about different components, different features of the model that you can figure out where to learn more on your own. So we'll spend the first hour together going through this series of lightning talks, then have a quick break, and then spend the last couple hours working on a couple of different options that are both single point, different flavors of single point simulations before coming back together and closing for what's been a very short tutorial. Before we get started, does anyone have questions, or are we good to have Peter go? For presenters who are just kind of logging on, I'll have you share your screen. You can present your own slides, and then maybe as we're transitioning, if folks have questions during that transition between speakers, we can ask questions then. Great. Well, if no one has questions now, I'll turn it over and let Peter talk about land use and land cover change.
Thanks, Will. Let's get my screen sharing up. Okay. So I'm Peter Lawrence. I'm in the terrestrial sciences section at NCAR. One of my chief things I do is land use and land cover change. So putting together all the data sets that run behind CTSM and in the CMIP6 experiments, all of those components. So what I'm going to do is quickly take you, and I was very fortunate that Dave gave a great background and introduction and sort of motivation for why we do land use and land cover change from a carbon cycle and also from a biogeophysics perspective. But because we only got a short time, I'm going to quickly get into this. So as Dave said, the way we represent the heterogeneity of the landscape of the world is by taking this grid approach and then doing what we call subgrid tiling. So you go from the grid cell, which is whatever resolution that you decided to run your model at, and you can break it down into the subcomponents of that at a land unit level. So we have vegetation, lakes, urban, glaciers, crops. And one of the nice things about that is that rather than just being static, we can change it on an annual basis. So what happens is that composition of what is natural vegetation, what is crops. And now, like looking going forward, we're looking at lakes and urban and glaciers all being dynamically able to change as well on that sort of time step period. So below the land unit level, we have columns. So this is basically where all the soils are represented in terms of hydrology and soil cover. But we can basically change anything. We can change things at the land unit level and also at the plant functional type and crop functional type level below. So on top of the changes in land use and land cover change, we can actually do other things such as wood harvest. So we can go into all the plant functional types and all the tree types, and we can say, okay, let's take out carbon in terms of wood carbon that comes out. And so we can do this forestry process. We also do agriculture. So we have to prescribe the amount of irrigation, the amount of fertilizer, and the types of crops that we have within the crop model. So to do that for these time series, we start off with the current day, and we have a whole set of tools that allow us to go from current day satellite and inventory products, and we pull them together and we can produce a snapshot of the world as it is every year. And I haven't got very much time to go through this process, but what you can see is there's a whole number of products that come together. And we produce up here in this top right, these time series. And we've got trees on the top and then crop area on the bottom. And this goes back to 6,000 years before the Common Era, so about 8,000 years ago. And we have these pathways forwards through the shared socioeconomic pathways, which have different land use. And here you can see there are 5 of those SSPs here. So the red one represents SSP 370, which is the largest deforestation and largest crop expansion, whereas SSP 126, which tries to do climate mitigation, has a reforestation component to it and a much smaller increase in crops. This is sort of just a little the motivation that Dave was talking about before was, well, land use, even though current day it isn't like such a massive amount of carbon that's coming out. If we look historically, it's not until about the 1950s that actually fossil fuel emissions exceed land use emissions. And you can see that in terms of a third of all of the carbon that's actually in the atmosphere from human activities comes from land use and land cover change. Just quickly, when we represent land use and land cover change, we can actually then run the model in different ways. So we can do we can do a full land use land cover change versus a no land use land cover change. And that allows us to do the carbon analysis. I'm going to call it there because that's my 3 minutes. So there we go.
Great.
And I'll stop sharing.
Gordon, if you want to share your screen, and then if folks have questions for Peter, if you could raise your hand or drop them in the chat. And Peter's gonna have to run relatively quickly to make it to eighth grade graduation.
Okay. So I'm Gordon Bonin, a senior scientist in the terrestrial sciences section. I'm going to talk about the surface energy balance, sort of canopy fluxes portion of CLM. And this is fundamental to CLM. Regardless of all the bells and whistles and everything CLM does, it has to provide what's called the sort of the lower boundary conditions required by the atmosphere model. And this is albedo, long wave radiation, and then the turbulent fluxes of momentum, sensible heat, latent heat, and water vapor. The way that this is done is actually by writing out equations for the surface energy balance and then solving for the temperature that satisfies the energy balance. And nominally what this is it's the absorbed solar and absorbed long wave radiation. It must be balanced by the emitted long wave radiation, the sensible heat flux, the latent heat flux, and soil heat storage. The emitted long wave radiation, sensible heat, latent heat, and soil heat storage can be written as a function of a surface temperature. And what the CLM does is nominally solves for a surface temperature that balances this energy budget. Also want to point out now that CLM 5 or later versions of it also includes a biomass heat storage. That's an additional term in the energy budget. The way CLM does this is what's called a dual source canopy. There are fluxes from the leaves in the canopy to the canopy airspace. There's a flux from the ground to the canopy airspace, and then there's a flux from the canopy airspace to the atmosphere. The CLM is solving for the vegetated temperature and the ground temperature and the sort of surface air temperature that canopy air temperature that satisfies these equations. On the canopy side, it's a big leaf canopy, and there's no vertical structure to it all. It's just sort of a leaf. It can be divided, it's divided into sunlit and shaded components, but there is no vertical structure. And that really contrasts with the soil, which has 20 layers going to 8.5 meters, 5 bedrock layers down to 50 meters, and 12 snow layers. So the soil processes are resolved vertically, but the canopy processes aren't. And I'll come back to that in a minute. The standard way of testing these models is to compare to eddy covariance flux tower data. This is a really old study, one of the first studies that actually did this in boreal forest back in 1997. And I put this up just to sort of say, I really think the development of these models has been advanced in parallel with eddy covariance flux tower data. We couldn't have done it without those data sets. The code that we use to do the surface fluxes in CLM goes back 30 years ago or so to Bob Dickinson's biosphere-atmosphere transfer scheme. There are other ways of doing things, more advanced ways. This is a multi-layer canopy that I've been working on that actually does resolve profiles through the canopy. And the key point I want to say here is I really think the physics and physiology of this model is simpler and more consistent with theory than is the CLM big leaf canopy. So you can think of this as in terms of, is this a complexity, adding complexity, or is it actually reducing complexity? I'd say it's reducing complexity. And then the final thing I want to end with is this slide that Dave Lawrence showed yesterday about CLM is just the starting point for your science. It's not the science itself. You know, Dave did a really good job of sort of summarizing this, particularly this idea of easy to run the model and get an answer, but it's much harder to understand why you get this answer. I think this bullet he left off, and I think it's an important one. Just because it's in the model doesn't mean it's correct. We like to think we know what we're doing, but we don't always get things right. And you really need to be critical about what's in the model. Just because it's there doesn't mean we're actually doing it right, and doesn't mean that it can't be corrected. And I think surface fluxes really point to that. And I'll leave it there.
Great, thanks, Gordon. Any questions for Gordon?
Will, am I next?
I was going to do biogeochemistry next. Is that all right?
Yep, yep.
And
Could I
then,
could I ask Gordon a question?
yeah, go ahead.
The big leaf is the standard one, and I guess you have shaded and sunlit. When you have diffuse radiation, like when it's cloudy, does that give more radiation under the shaded part? Is that how it works?
Yeah, that's the diffuse radiation penetrates more deeply into the canopy. So you're seeing the shaded leaves being more illuminated. Also, I do want to point out that the sunlit and shaded leaves are only used to calculate photosynthesis and stomata conductance. The energy balance calculations are still done for a single big leaf. So in effect, what you're doing is you're getting a sunlit and shaded stomata conductance that gets integrated to a canopy conductance, and that single canopy conductance is used to calculate fluxes for a single big leaf. So it's not a full big sunlit shaded model, it's a partial sunlit shaded model. But Alan, the point you make about diffuse radiation is correct, and that will show up through the photosynthesis and stomata conductance of the sunlit and shaded leaves.
Thanks.
Great. So we'll quickly jump to biogeochemistry. And I kind of think of CLM as having two big components. And so one is the biogeophysics, which, the hydrology and canopy fluxes that Gordon was talking about are part of the biogeophysics. And then subsequently, we think about biogeochemistry. And the reason for thinking about biogeochemistry is kind of evident by a plot that many of you have seen one flavor of before. So this is actually data not from Mauna Loa and the Keeling curve that many of us are used to seeing, but also from Niwot Ridge, which is just up the road from where we are in Boulder. And I got to drag my family up there a couple of winters ago, and it's it's one of these, like, to me, seminal places where science happens, and it's like a shack at 12,000 feet. So this is where the data are collected from in this picture. But it's after Mauna Loa, it's one of the longest CO2 records that we have. And Dave showed this figure yesterday, but I feel like it's helpful for me as a biogeochemist to think about how new this science is. And so things like the carbon cycle really only came into large-scale Earth system models really around the turn of this century. So since my professional career started. And then things like nutrients came on a little bit after that. And so even though biogeochemistry and carbon cycle science are old, they're still relatively new in terms of their science. And so this is the picture, kind of a blown up version of what biogeochemistry is trying to do in CLM. And so as opposed to trying to go over all of this, which is impossible in 3 to 5 minutes, what I did was in this talk linked the kind of highlights of what we're doing in biogeochemistry to parts of the tech note. And so I'll share a link to this talk in just a minute in the chat, but you can follow these links to look at, what are we doing for photosynthesis? What are we doing for allocation? But basically there's kind of 4 to 5 parts of what we're doing for biogeochemistry. So photosynthesis is obviously the first one. Then after plants have some GPP to deal with, they have to allocate it to different components, to leaves or to fine roots or to wood, and all of those different, the allocation has different stoichiometry that's associated with it that's specific for each PFT. Based on what kind of tissue you have and how much nitrogen is in it, that determines the autotrophic respiration rates. And then phenology is kind of a big lever in the model, and we'll talk a little bit more about phenology in the practical today. And then there's also mortality and turnover. So all of this changes with fates, and Jackie will talk a little bit about fates, but in CLM5 and CTSM 5.1, there's more to it than just these plant things. So after leaves drop, then they decompose. There's a whole section on soil biogeochemistry. There's a bunch of nitrogen inputs. We also think about methane. There's a BVOC module that connects to the atmosphere. And then on top of it, we also represent carbon isotopes, both C13 and C14. If you want to dig a little bit deeper, then the tech note's a good kind of high level overview, but if you actually want to look at the code, here's some of the modules that you can look at. And these are in the source code, which is under SRC. And then there's biogeophysics, where photosynthesis is handled, biogeochemistry, where all the carbon and nitrogen stuff is handled, and then soil biogechem is its own directory. That's where all the below ground stuff happens, all the action. So that's it for biogeochemistry. Any questions while Jackie, I don't know if Donica's on.
Yeah, I'm here.
Oh, you're here. Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's do crops next.
Okay.
And fates.
Yeah, I can do that. Okay, you can all see this.
Yep, that looks great.
Great. Okay, so I'll give you a quick overview of crops in CLM5. Really, I want to start with just emphasizing that agriculture changes the land surface. It changes both how it looks, which is really important for physical impacts, and it also changes how it functions, which is really important for biogeochemical impacts. And for these reasons, it's really important to understand and to simulate the role of agriculture and agricultural management within the Earth system. And that's part of the motivation for us, including this in CTSM. Currently, we have, I guess, what I'll call 8 crop types. There are some additional crop types in that we differentiate between temperate and tropical corn and soybean. We do have bioenergy crops are new. We also have winter and spring wheat in CLM5. So we have a lot of different kinds of crop, or a lot of the major kinds of crops. We also have global distributions that change through time, and part of this came up in Peter's talk on land use change earlier. But the crop area is based on that LUH2 data, or the land use harmonization 2 data, and then I guess adjusted, or the crop types in particular are differentiated using data from Portman et al. So yeah, this is really what makes crops work within an Earth system model, is the fact that we have them globally and that they're also able to change through time. Crops are a little bit different than native vegetation in that they have active phenology, and currently we have 4 phenological phases. The first is planting, the second is leaf emergence, the third is grain fill, and the fourth is harvest. So each of these is a trigger for a new phenological phase. They're all temperature-based triggers, so keep that in mind. There's no soil moisture or nutrient stress or anything. And I want to highlight 2 forthcoming developments because they're going to allow for a little, hopefully better representation of phenology in CLM5. The first is work led by Bin Peng, which is integrating the APSIM model into CLM. Currently, it's based on AgroIBIS. And so this will include triggers based on water and nutrient availability, among other things. And the second is work led by Sam Rabin, who is integrating prescribed crop calendars. And so this will allow us to use observations of when crops are planted. We have two types of management are included currently. The first that I'll highlight is fertilization. Fertilization happens by crop type and by year, and is again based on the LUH2 data. It is applied when the leaves emerge. We have manure that is constant, is a constant application through time, 2 grams of nitrogen per meter squared per year. And then we have chemical fertilizer, which is prescribed by the crop type, the year, and the country. We do have some development needs, but this is a decent representation of fertilizer for the time being. The other management method that I'll highlight here is irrigation. So irrigation is applied daily if soil moisture falls below a fixed threshold. We currently have a couple different application methods. Drip is available by default. Sean Swenson also developed a method for sprinkler irrigation, and Yi Yang is developing a flood irrigation method that we're hoping to incorporate into CLM. There's also multiple water sources. By default, the water comes from rivers or surface water, but there's also groundwater and reservoirs that are available. The reservoirs is under development by Ina van der Kellen. I'll just give you a quick highlight of model performance. First is that we see that global crop yields increase through time. So the black line is CLM, the red line is UNFAO. And so these are global crop yields. And what you'll notice here is that from when data were first available through about the 1990s, CLM does a decent job of predicting global crop yields, but then it levels off. And that's because we don't include processes related to agricultural intensification, technological advances, planting advances, things like that. I'll also just highlight really quickly corn yields compared to an FAO EarthStat data set that we put together. And this is probably the crop that we do the worst on in terms of looking at spatial patterns of yield. And I want to highlight two things. One is that corn yields are underestimated in temperate latitudes, and they're overestimated in tropical latitudes. So I'll stop there.
Great, thanks, Danica. Jackie, do you want to pull up your screen?
Sorry, I lost my. Can you hear me and see me? Okay,
Yep.
Great.
Looks great, thanks.
Hold on one second. So, yeah, I'll be talking about FATES, the Functionally Assembled Terrestrial Ecosystem Simulator. And I want to take a minute before I start to acknowledge the global FATES team. This wouldn't be possible without an incredible number of people coming together to collaborate and work on this. In particular, Charlie Coven, Rosie Fisher, and Ryan Knox. Okay, gets me every time. And so you heard a lot about yesterday what terrestrial ecology is in Earth system models. And Dave probably mentioned this, but the way that land is implemented, the way that vegetation heterogeneity is implemented, ignores complex vegetation structure. And so we're missing a lot of detail. And so within most Earth system models, you have a big leaf, and so a pool of carbon, and then those pools are separated by a given area. Okay, but these pools, they don't have realistic ecological dynamics. And it's difficult to reconcile changes in these pools with real world observations. And so at the other end of the spectrum, we have individual based models that can capture individual trees as they go through their life cycle of succession through birth, growth, and death. These are much more detailed and realistic, but they can be prohibitive to implement in a global Earth system model. Cohort models are the in-between solution. And so what they do is they capture different sizes of different types of vegetation using density for each size. And so you get more information with hopefully improved computational costs over an individual based model. And so FATES is a cohort model. It's a module that functions within the community land model, and it replaces the traditional big leaf pooled vegetation with more realistic vegetation. This allows us to get plant physiology, competition, dynamic assembly, and vegetation distribution, which is still cutting edge for these types of models. And so within FATES, the FATES portion handles everything in this yellow box. FATES handles all the vegetation structure, regeneration, seeds, as well as physiology. And then it interacts with the host land model. And it interacts with CLM, it can also interact with ELM. And so those interactions have different layers of coupling in terms of how frequently that information is updated with each time step. Something like photosynthesis is tightly coupled and updated multiple times within a time step. And so within FATES, we have multiple patches where a big leaf model has different pools of vegetation. We have multiple patches that track time since disturbance. And so you can have a newly disturbed forest within a grid cell, And then on a different patch within that grid cell, you can have a mature forest or an old growth forest. And so what this means is that if you think back to the difference between the host land model patch versus a FATES patch, within the host land model, you're going to have a single pool giving you information about whatever process you're interested in, these coupled processes. But within FATES, we have a heterogeneous patch. And so that information is, depending on the process you're talking about, is going to be an emergent from the structure on that patch. And so fundamentally, if you're thinking about canopy turbulence, you're going to get a different picture when you consider this heterogeneous canopy. And this is area that is in need of development. So if you're interested in this, please get in touch. There are a lot of instances in reality where structure is essential. Hydrodynamics, we have a FATES hydro module that tracks a lot of detailed information to get to capture more details about the structure. Nutrients, we have PARTE, which is the nutrient-enabled model. Fire, I'm not going to read the details of these. You'll have access to this talk. Size structure is essential to mortality and regeneration processes associated with fire. You get variability in snow occlusion. Pests differentially attack different sizes of trees, different types of trees. Harvest, we all know that harvest, you don't go and harvest everything. You want to choose the trees or the sizes of trees you want. I talked about canopy turbulence. There are many processes where structure is an important component of it. And so we feel that FATES gives us more information than what we have with the big leaf model. Oh, sorry, I'm going way over. FATES code, we have technical documentation and a user's guide. I encourage you to start here. And with that, I'll finish. Sorry, I went long.
No worries. Sean, do you want to share your screen? Any questions for Jackie while Sean's getting his up? Looks like Hannah asked a question in the chat. Looking at the outputs, I figured the level of PFT given in FATES has dimensions of 12. Does that mean FATES can only go up to 12 PFTs?
I'll answer it in the chat.
Okay. Great. Go for it, Sean.
Okay. I'm just going to give a quick overview here of this Hillslope hydrology model that we've been developing. And my slide won't go forward. Okay. Oh. Okay. So as was mentioned yesterday in other talks, CLM or CTSM uses this hierarchical data structure, and on the vegetated land unit, the normal configuration consists of a single column for describing the soil, and then inside that column there can be different kinds of vegetation arranged in patches, and that's typically how the models run and has been run in the past. Although, as you know, crops, for example, can exist on their own column. So, using that same kind of structure, we can do similar things. Instead of having a single column, we can do multi-column. One way you might do that would be to create patches which no longer interact and no longer compete for resources. Another way that you might do that is to actually connect those soil columns via the subsurface lateral flow, sometimes called drainage, sometimes called base flow. And so then these columns can be connected within the model, and they can pass water back and forth. So just sort of schematically, what we call a hill slope then is a series of connected hill slopes, which essentially are sharing a lower boundary condition given by a water table, and water can be passed between the columns and between a stream channel. Again, the same kind of figure, but which is highlighting that each one of these columns will act independently in terms of their vertical processes and then the water from the lateral flow coming past between columns. And so the reasons that we're interested in doing this is the typical model has no real notion of topography within it. But if you look across the landscape, then there are obvious correlations and covariances between patterns in, for example, vegetation and topography. So these are some examples of places where you see these, in some cases, sharp gradients in vegetation, and these are related to the topography and the soil moisture within them. And so what this might allow us to do then is look at some of the spatial covariances between things like vegetation and position on the hill slope and soil moisture and position in the hill slope, and start to look at why some of these patterns emerge. There's different ways to connect these columns. So on the left shows a standard, a single column connected to the routing network. You could do serial or parallel connectivity, or you could do some sort of hybrid connectivity, and all these things can be specified on your input data set. What some of the outputs look like are, I should also say we can also do downscaling of meteorology based on the characteristics of the hill slopes. And so we now can look at the impacts on, for example, insolation, incoming radiation due to slope and aspect. So here's just an example of the Western US comparing mean annual solar radiation. The top left would be a north facing, and the bottom left would be a south facing. And so you can see you have these sort of large differences in the annual mean in terms of incoming solar radiation due to these topographic effects. We can also do precipitation downscaling. So both the amount and the partitioning between rain and snow are affected by elevation gradients. And again, just an example of showing the evolution of the snowpack for a low elevation at the top left and a high elevation at the bottom right. So you can see that the snowpack persists longer due to both differences in temperature and differences in this partitioning in the amount of precipitation. And then finally, just an example of what this might look like. So here, this would be a grid cell that would have 20 columns within it. And so you get this essentially a distribution of soil moisture states. So these are all soil moisture with depth and time. And you can have a bunch of columns which are relatively dry. And then you can see the impact of the convergence of subsurface lateral flow. And you also have some columns in which they're much wetter and an active water table exists. So right now I'm in the process of bringing this into Maine, and it's quite possible this will be in there sometime this summer. Thanks.
Thanks, Sean.
Now I can't get out of this thing. There we go.
And Brett, are you on?
Yeah, can you hear me? I think I'm on.
Yep.
Cool. All right, let's see if I can share my screen. All right, are we good? Okay.
Yep.
So yeah, I am Brett Raska. I'm part of the data assimilation research section here at NCAR, and we have developed an ensemble DA system that you can couple with CLM called the Data Assimilation Research Testbed. And so, data assimilation, as many of you could be aware, it's when you're fusing information from your model forecast with observations to help give you the best idea of what's going on as possible. And so to kind of put this in context of what you've learned this week in different modes of CLMs, you have CLM BGC, so the full biogeochemistry, which has really no external constraints. You're relying on all these model mechanisms and developments and parameterizations to give you an internally prognostic simulation of what the land surface is doing. You also have CLM SP, satellite phenology, which I think I've been using in the tutorial this week. And the idea here is instead of no constraints, you're actually prescribing leaf area and vegetation on the model. And so the idea there is to try to reduce biases so you could get a better forecast of carbon fluxes, for example, which would likely compare more favorably to flux tower observations. CLM DART, when they're coupled together, is kind of the next step from there, where you can basically bring in any observation, preferably something that's simulated or closely simulated by CLM, And so you can kind of constrain behavior from multiple directions. And it also provides you uncertainty estimates on top of that. And so how do we do that? So really quickly, the Ensemble DA system uses a Bayesian approach. And so the best model forecast of the posterior in blue is a combination of the forecast generated from CLM, so that's like the prior estimate, combined with observations. And so we fuse those two things together, taking into account uncertainty to come up with the best solution for what the land surface is doing. And so on the bottom part of the screen here, I'm trying to illustrate that a bit further. So we're literally generating an ensemble of CLM runs, a multi-instance run, and we're getting that through sampling the uncertainty in CAM, so the atmospheric model in CTSM, and those are driving different CLM instances and sampling the uncertainty in the model forecast. We run that forward in time, and then we come to a point where we have a series of observations, and then we estimate what the model thinks those observations should be going up to step 3, and then we compare them to the true observations and then adjust those more closely such that the model is representing reality or what we observe. And then the final step is we take that information, we can apply it to the rest of the complete model state of the system. And so I'm just trying to show an overview of different types of work that we've been involved in. So assimilating leaf area biomass observations in kind of vulnerable ecosystems like the Arctic boreal region, the top left, the Western United States, subject to drought and wildfires, where we try to get a better idea of carbon exchange. And also we have a lot of interest in dealing with hydrological applications, so assimilating in soil moisture to get a better idea of what the surface soil moisture is doing, and also the subsurface soil moisture, and also snow cover, especially snow water equivalents. So you can imagine if you get a better idea of what hydrology is doing, that has implications for the carbon cycle, but it also has implications for the surface albedo and the surface energy balance as well. And so really quickly, I just wanted to advertise some of the tutorials. I mean, generally Dart is recommended for more advanced users, but it's a good point to introduce this to all like new users as well. We'd recommend starting with the 2 top tutorials on our website, the Dart tutorial itself and the Dart lab, which goes into more theory than I can provide here, and it uses MATLAB, so you can go and use a toy model to test these concepts. And when you're familiar with that, you can go into the CLM5 Dart tutorial, which I've designed, and it's just giving a quick overview of how it's organized. And so I kind of included 13 steps on the left right there. So going through like detailed instructions on the downloading, the setup, running, and the diagnosis of your assimilation run for a simple example. And just kind of an example on the right, I took excerpts of what the documentation looks like. So instructions, detailed examples on what the scripts should look like, and a bunch of definitions so you can understand what's going on there. So the CLM5 Dart tutorial isn't containerized. It does assume that you have an account on Cheyenne, and generally when you're using ensemble systems, it is recommended that you have a high performance computer, but most of the initial tutorials can be done on your local machine. And so that's it. If you have any other questions, please contact us and check out our documentation. Thanks.
Awesome, thanks, Brett. I think Keith, you're up next. If Brett, you can stop sharing. So we're kind of transitioning from more of the model, I don't know, direct model science and code to like other features, so things like Dart, and then diagnostics that Keith will talk about here. And I can see there's a bunch going on in the chat, but I'm not totally able to follow. So I'm hoping that other folks are able to kind of follow what's going on in the chat that can help out here. Cool. You want to put that in presenter mode, Keith?
How's that?
It's no change.
Oh, you're breaking up a little bit. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're kind of fuzzy. It's still not in presenter mode. We're just seeing the regular slides.
Huh, it's in presenter mode here.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
That's fine. You can maybe, I don't know if you can make it any bigger, or I can still read your screen's fine.
And you're also a little fuzzy, Keith. I don't know if you have a microphone.
Yeah. Peter's saying I have low resources or something like that. Is it in presenter mode now?
No, but I do see that you've got a little hourglass waiting. So I don't know if it's just a slow connection. Now the hourglass is gone. But
try doing a couple applications and see if that helps.
okay.
I have ESPN running on here, so now.
No changes on our end, but I think it's all right. You can go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, some people within the terrestrial sciences section, they've kind of covered ILAM yesterday in his talk, but ILAM is the International Land Model Benchmarking project. It can be found on GitHub. The main thing is it's support the design and development of a new open source benchmarking software system for use by the international community. Can you see the next slide?
Nope.
All right, let me see. How about now?
No, it's like you're. Oh yeah, now we see it.
Documentation.
Yep.
Yeah, so there's a fair amount of documentation on ILAM. There's a paper in James. It describes the design, the theory, and implementation. You notice I'm not on the author list here. I just basically installed run ILAM. There's also tutorials, very good tutorials on how to install the package and how to run it. A bunch of different options for running it. So what I thought I'd do is take a look at some of the example outputs. Assuming this will work. So after the package is run, you can copy the results over to a web server. You see that web page?
We're just seeing the stoplight scoring matrix from the landing page.
Yeah, you're seeing the main page.
Yeah.
Main ILAM page.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, so this is the main page. So this, for example, is a comparison between CLM 5.0 and this.
So hey Keith, we're seeing the we're seeing your perspective of the PowerPoint. We are not seeing the web page. Like it seems like you need to swap screens. There you go. Now you're on. That's right. That's right.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, so this is the main page. So in this column here, CLM 5, this comparison between CLM 5 and CTSM 5.1. And then these are essentially a summary score page where these kind of orange values mean the model is doing worse than the other model, and the blue colors are where the model is doing better. And you see these categories. So there's like ecosystem carbon cycle category, hydrology cycle category, radiation energy cycle, forcings, and then relationships. Relationships are pretty interesting. So essentially like how evapotranspiration varies with leaf area index in the observations and in the model. There's a number of those relationships. So you can click on any of these to look at the results. So for instance, this is biomass, and there's 5 observational data sets you can compare the model to. So let's click on global carbon. Assume you're seeing a new page here that has biomass global carbon at the top.
Yep.
Yeah. So this is the kind of the mean state page. So there's a table here of statistics for the 2 models, and then the scores. So there's like a bias score, spatial distribution score, and an overall score. And there's plots of the observations, the benchmark mean, model mean, bias score. It's a nice tailored diagram down here. Compared to the models. There's a data information page over here that tells you where the observational data came from, references, etc. These are all models where you can look at the models you're comparing all together, and you can size the screen to get these plots together. And then there's also, I didn't run it for this, but you can look at all these results for different regions. So there's 10 to 15 predefined regions you can look at the results at. And you can also define your own regions. So with all that, those problems, I think I'll stop there.
I like the live demo. It's great. The live demo looks better than your PowerPoint slides.
Yeah.
Eric, do you want to go ahead and share your screen? And so Dave and Keith kind of both mentioned this, but we use a diagnostics package and ILAM regularly as we're doing model development, just to see what parts of the model are looking better, what different code changes that come in, and which ones are looking worse. So do you want to put it in slideshow view, Eric? Good, looks great.
You're muted, Eric.
Yes, thank you, Dave. Yeah, just didn't realize that. Okay, awesome. So I'm going to talk a little bit about software engineering for CLM, and my main thing I'm going to talk about is why you should care about software engineering. So that's my next slide. Let's see. Why do you care? Fundamentally, CTSM is science that's expressed in terms of software. So fundamentally, CTSM is a software project. And CTSM is a scientific instrument, and like other precision scientific instruments, needs to be managed in a way that allows for the science done with it to flourish. And so we do need to pay attention to the software engineering. This is the part that why you should care is using good software engineering practices will help the development of your science. So there's some things that I'm going to talk about that are really going to help you to manage your science, get your science changes in by following, good practices. And the other thing is that following good practices will make it easier for your work to come back into CTSM. So if you're doing something that you think would be useful for the community, and you want to see it come back into CTSM, the better your practices are, the more likely that is to happen. So that's why you should care. Okay, so what are some practices that help? And the main thing, and everybody finds this in their own way, is that you need to save off working versions. In the beginning of my career, I did not use version control, but I did find very quickly that having saved versions that worked was really important because you can make you make a change and then something breaks, and then finding what broke is really difficult if you don't have saved versions that you know work. So because the truth is that debugging is always very hard, but comparing code to working versions can be much easier way to find problems. And usually what you will be doing will be changing the model, changing the existing model in ways that you know, it wasn't designed for. And so you're going to find problems. And by being able to compare to working versions, you're going to be able to find those problems much easier. So what that above means is that you really need to use version control of some sort. Now, sometimes what people do is that they, you know, save off working versions with just copying files around, which isn't as efficient as using a version control system. And in the tutorial, we've already kind of introduced you to Git, and we recommend that you use that system. That you take advantage of Git. It'll make it easier for your development and easy for your science to be worked out. So next question is, how do you interact with us? So the first thing I need to say is that we have limited resources, but we do want you to send reports on problems you run into with issues in GitHub, for example. And if something you're doing may be of general interest, you should create an issue in GitHub as well. And if the land model working group is interested in your work, you'll likely cycle through from having an issue to then having a pull request, and then finally your feature becoming part of the model. And another way to interact with us is to interact with the community in the Discuss CSM forums, which I'm going to talk about a little bit. And actually in the chat, we were talking about the Discuss CSM forums, where there was a question that was on the forums that was being answered. And the advantage of the Discuss CSM forums is that you interact with not only those of us at NCAR that are working on the model, but you work with the whole community that's working on CSM and CLM. So that's a great way to do it. So, and then lastly, some websites for help. So the CTSM wiki page is here. There's a development wiki that shows how to shows the development cycle and what you should do in terms of Git and setting up branches and that sort of thing. And then the Discuss CSM forums. And I'm just going to quickly go there. Let's see if this works. It worked for Keith, so maybe it'll work for me. Okay, it looks like it does. Okay, so this is the GitHub page and the wiki. So if you just go to GitHub CTSM, you go to code, and here's the wiki, and on the right side is all the development guides and development workflow is a good one to go through. That talks about testing. There's also this quick start to CTSM development with Git, and that's really the main one. It talks about learning Git, setting up Git, creating a fork, creating a branch, etc. Okay, so
Eric, can you just stay there for a minute?
Oh, sure.
And maybe
yes.
Can you zoom in on your screen a little bit?
Oh,
like scroll to
if I
the
make
top.
it smaller, does that help?
Yeah, that looks better. And can you just scroll to the top? I just had a hard time kind of following. So, you know, a lot of times people that are new to Git, one of the things that I always try to remember is like how much there is on a GitHub page to look at. And so like Eric, can you point to where the issues are?
Yes.
So there's this issues tab. There's, Eric, like Eric said, he always goes to code because that's where he's working all the time. I always go to the wiki. And so there's that kind of wiki book icon because there's just an unbelievable amount of resources there. But those little tabs at the top that sort of look innocuous are unbelievably helpful in navigating through a GitHub page if you're not used to doing that. Or if you have 1,000 browser windows open like Eric does.
Exactly, I do.
Sorry, I just wanted to jump in because for users that are new to GitHub, navigating those buttons on the top, I think, is one of the more important features that is helpful to know about.
Yeah, and so the code is, and you can browse the code this way. I talked about, making issues, and so you could make a new issue here. You could look through existing issues. Sometimes you might find a problem in the model and you wonder about, has somebody else run into this? And you can search and see if somebody else has found the same problem. Again, if you have work that's going to come into the main model, that's going to be done through a pull request. So that you might look at that. We do have some projects that might be useful to look at and see, where big projects are, and then of course the wiki, which has a bunch of resources on helping to work with the model. So let's see. Oh, and the last thing I just wanted to show the Discuss CSM forum, and this. So the main forum is for all of CSM. And there's a forum for CTSM, CLM, those are RTM, and that's this one. And it looks like the question that was asked in the chat was here, and Adriana answered that question 14 minutes ago. So this is another great resource to work with the community on asking questions on how you do something, or finding problems and solving issues. So, all right, that's it for me.
Thanks, Eric. Let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break now, and then we'll come back and kind of regroup, get ready for the practical session. So come back at, we'll give you a 12-minute break. Come back at 10 after the hour. That's all right.